sword and sorcery. Now, you've probably heard this term floating around before, but like me, you didn't really understand what it meant. Sword and sorcery, for a number of reasons, has lost all meaning. Until very recently. I've had a chance to speak to author Brian Murphy, who wrote this incredible book, Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery. In it, he basically details some of the defining characteristics of the term, where it originated, and some of its early history. Basically, we want more people to get into the genre. The thing is, this conversation was incredibly meaty. There was a lot of information, and not everything made it into the final video. Anyway, I've rambled for way too long. Let's have a listen to what Brian Murphy has to say.
Well, man, I appreciate you having me on the YouTube channel here. By way of introduction, I'm Brian Murphy. Probably better known maybe in your circles as the author of Flame and Crimson, A History of Sword and Sorcery, a book that was published through Pulp Hero Press back in the year that shall not be named, 2020. It's my first and still only book, but I've been writing about sword and sorcery and heroic fantasy and all things adjacent on my blog called The Silver Key.
How did you come across, Conan and Robert E. Howard, and what was the thing that sparked that love with that character?
Yeah, I tell the story at the beginning of the book. I was a young kid. I was probably, I think, about 12. Oh, it's a little bit hazy when you go back that far. I'm about half a century now, so they're talking about 38 years ago. But I used to have a old used bookstore in my hometown of Reading, Massachusetts, where I grew up. It was within walking distance of my house, and I got an allowance. I made a few extra bucks cutting grass, and I was buying comic books at the time. Mostly actually superhero stuff, which I loved then, and I still do. Your Captain America was a favorite of mine, and the Avengers, Thor, Hulk, all that good stuff. And I don't know. I was just in the bookstore one day looking to buy the usual rounds, and I looked down at the floor, and there was a box. Right, it was an unmarked cardboard box, and a bunch of what looked like comic books were in it, but they were standing upright, so all you could see was the top, the top pages. So I pulled one out, and it was one of the early Conans. I think it was like issue number 24, if I'm correct. Savage Sword of Conan.
Yes.
So this is the old black and white magazine. I mean, it's technically a comic book. Is probably more accurately described as a magazine. They kind of skirted the comics code with Savage Sword, but it was, it had articles in it, and it had John Buscema artwork in there, and it had Earl Norham on the cover, who was a wonderful painter. And I opened that thing up, started flipping through it, and I was just blown away. You had like decapitations, and you had some nudity, and you had all the stuff that you don't typically see, in Marvel's The Avengers in probably 19.
Yeah, definitely wouldn't be approved by the Comics Code. Yeah.
No, it was not approved by the Comics Code. So that just blew me away, and I immediately bought that and maybe one or two other issues. They were like $1.25, I think the guy was charging for these back issues. And I just every week I would go back with my allowance and buy a couple more, and that was the gateway for me, was the comic book. Later on, it wasn't until a few years later that and it was from the same store that I found the Lancers. So the Conan saga, published by the Lancer. It was an old paperback publisher, and those were, I mean, they're not from a purist perspective, pure Robert E. Howard, but there was a lot of original Howard in there, enough to really say, wow, this is great stuff. It's mixed with Lynn Carter and L. Sprague de Camp, but it had and then it had those amazing covers by Frank Frazetta.
Amen. Yeah, one of the greatest.
So that was it, man. I was all in when I found that stuff, and have been a sword and sorcery fan ever since.
I guess now it's the best time to kind of like start. What is sword and sorcery? What makes it different from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Dragonlance and all these other stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's still a lot of debate over this. And I will say that, like, just because I wrote Flaming Crimson, it doesn't mean I know all the answers, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's not like there is a huge body of literature out there or panel of experts that are telling people what sword and sorcery is and is not. Fritz Leiber, who was one of the principal authors of this type of fiction, I've never read Fritz Leiber. He wrote, he's most famous for Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser.
Yeah.
And they were initially published in a magazine called Unknown in the late 30s. And he was inspired by Robert E. Howard, along with some other authors. But it was a different type of fiction than what you were seeing from people like, at the time, E.R. Edison or H. Rider Haggard, George MacDonald, who were more like literary and more rambling fiction authors. These were the guys that were the immediate precursors and predecessors of, just mentioned, J.R.R. Tolkien. We typically call those guys high fantasy today, as opposed to these pulp authors I just mentioned, Fritz Leiber and Robert E. Howard, that were really writing for pulp audiences. They were writing short fiction that was a little bit more for professional sale and for genre expectations. You get published in Weird Tales, your story should contain certain elements, and it by nature has to be short. It has to be episodic because you're writing for a monthly publication. So some people might call it a little bit more commercial. I don't know. It was definitely like a working man's fiction. These pulp magazines were very popular at the time. Fritz wanted to come up with a name for this type of fiction that he was writing, or the likes of Unknown. And he eventually settled on. It was an interesting exchange of letters, which you can find. I've got a copy of some of this initial correspondence, but it was principally carried out in a fanzine called Amra, printed and circulated, small circulation group of fans that would contribute to it. But Michael Moorcock, who was a fledgling author, Michael Moorcock, of course, would go on to write about Elric of Melniboné and his whole corpus of the Eternal Champion. He and Fritz Leiber were just writing about this in the letters column of Amra, and Michael Moorcock asked Fritz Leiber for a name, and he suggested a couple different things. Fritz Leiber, though, ultimately said, I feel more certain than ever this should be called sword and sorcery fiction. And that was really how that name came about. I stress in the book that it wasn't like this genre sprang whole and entire out of the head of who I consider the originator when we've been talking about Robert E. Howard. Yeah. Robert E. Howard never used that phrase. He didn't set out to create a new subgenre of fantasy when he started writing Conan. But he was basically experimenting in the pages of Weird Tales. He was mixing together different genres like horror, like adventure fiction. And he just hit on this amazing formula with Conan, who was unique, and he was a barbarian. Principal elements I identify right out of the gate is it's men and women of action. One of the other proponents, I'm going to give someone credit here. He's actually an author working in the field. He's recently been signed to a contract by Bain Publishing. Howard Andrew Jones, he's all about the pacing. He thinks this is one of the things that makes sword and sorcery different. It doesn't have like that languid, drawn out 100 pages of world building that you sometimes will find in high fantasy. Typically the stories get right to the action, and the hero's doing something. They're moving forward. They're in pursuit of some type of treasure. A woman who's been abducted. Often they're all just to line their own pockets, but they're actually doing something and they're exerting their will on the world. That was really what the Conan stories were all about. That he was an adventurer through lands, and through that adventure you'd be introduced to the world. I think that's a key thing. It's not let me describe this world to you, but let me follow the adventures of this hero, and then we'll let the world be built around him or her as their adventures unfold. It's not like Howard didn't have a world. I don't want to mislead people. He created this amazing Hyborian age, and he wrote a famous essay about the Hyborian age. But it wasn't like front and center, hit you over the head with it. Let me load up my book with all these maps and talk about the history of it. It would be kind of there in drips and drabs as the story was being told. He would do these little snatches of verse, poems, epigraphs. His famous, the one that led off his first published story of Conan the Phoenix on the Sword. Where it was like a little bit of this manufactured history, and he would just give you a list of cities and a couple of defining characteristics. It was enough to go, wow, this is cool. I feel like I'm in a lived place, but I don't have to know the exact geography. And the other brilliant thing, of course, that Howard did was his Hyborian age is like a prehistory of our own world, and you can map a lot of those fictitious countries straight over to current globe. You have a lot of them sound alike. You have Vendia and you have Afghanistan and you have Samaria mapping approximately to northern Europe, and you have the Aesir and the Vanir, which is up in the up in Norway and Sweden. And it's so what that does is when he's talking about these places, you kind of feel grounded in them because they do feel very similar, even though there's magic in them and there might be some type of sanity blasting monster in them. But they're still set in lands that feel familiar with our own, and that's really another thing I mentioned too, is defining characteristic of sword and sorcery. It's got that historical grounding. Some people. There was another author I'll call out. His name is James Enge, and he's written these stories of Morlock the Enchanter, which has appeared in one of the contemporary pubs, Tales from the Magician's Skull. But he defines sword and sorcery as fantasy with dirt. Which is about as succinct and basic a definition as I've heard, and I kind of love that. It feels like you're in, you're not. These aren't like elevated princes and nobles and in some faraway land that you're looking at through, a clouded mirror. It's like in your face. The danger is imminent. People get hurt. Sometimes they get killed. Of course, we see that now with some of the grimdark and some of the new fiction that's really amped up the violence and the bloodshed and the fecal material and everything else. But sword and sorcery, I think, I consider it a precursor to that grimdark stuff.
One of the things that I also really love about the subgenre is how magic is handled. There is a distinction, like, I guess Harry Potter, one of the most famous examples. There is a school, magic has rules, and I guess it's with the element of the weird, thanks to Lovecraft maybe, but magic is completely unknown, and Conan absolutely is terrified of it. And in Elric of Melibene, like, you pay a very heavy toll to use it.
Yeah, I would agree. That's one of the things I love about it too. I don't know. I think the whole magic being like a commodity, like something you just kind of whip out, like you whip out like your laptop. I actually think it comes from Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of that stuff where you've got spellcasters. I'm an 8th level wizard, and I can cast these spells, and I know exactly what they do because it says so in the dungeon, in the player's handbook. And a lot of modern authors have been influenced by D&D. and I'm not dumping on Dungeons and Dragons. Like I played it for a long time. Um, Love it. I think it's a great game, and it's spun out an amazing industry. And I got into RuneQuest, and I've played Call of Cthulhu, and I'm not dumping on role playing, but it if you play by some of the rules as written, magic is pretty commonplace. You get +3 sword. You know exactly how it performs mechanically. And I would say the difference between that and sword and sorcery, as you just said, it's the stuff of the unknown. It's chaotic. You mentioned Elric of Melniboné, who so that was again Michael Moorcock writing in the '60s and '70s. He's still alive and writing today.
Yeah, absolute mad
Just
lad.
published a book.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
amazing. He's still with us. But Elric would summon demons, right? Like, and
Yeah.
these came at a cost, and they would often wind up killing the people that he loved. Or they would come at a tremendous physical cost, and he'd be exhausted morally, spiritually, physically from casting a spell. Conan, one of the things he was notoriously afraid of the supernatural. And it does have a very different feel than what you're probably going to get in a lot of contemporary fantasy, a lot of high fantasy where magic is just ubiquitous and everyone can use it. People kind of know what it is, and I mean, and it's at its worst, like you said. Again, not to dump on Harry Potter.
Yeah.
I credit Harry Potter. Brought a lot of people to the reading fold, but when there's a school of magic and people are going there to learn the rules of magic, it sort of makes, in my opinion, makes magic feel a little less magical and a little more mundane.
Yes.
Sword and sorcery, it's like it's something you don't want to mess with, but when it comes out, it does some cool shit.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I was very surprised when I heard about how important horror is to sword and sorcery, because when you look at like the paintings of Boris Vallejo, you have these idealistic men and women look like bodybuilders. They're kind of, their face is kind of like calm, but when you read, for example, I guess Queen of the Black Coast, you have these like winged apes just swooping down, and Conan is having none of it, but. But the main difference, and he do also mention that sword and sorcery heroes, though they're absolutely, shitting their pants, for lack of a better word, they still hold their ground, and I think that's so cool.
Yeah, that is another one of these 7 characteristics I talk about. You typically, again, you see some of these horror, and in particular like a Lovecraftian influence. So Howard was writing for a magazine, Weird Tales, which was suffused in horror. I mean, that was really a lot of the stuff you read in there was horror based. The big 3 is, as they called them, Weird Tales, which was H.P. Lovecraft, Robert E. Howard, and Clark Ashton Smith. 2 of those 3 were principally working in horror. That being Smith and Lovecraft. And Howard himself also wrote a lot of horror fiction. He wrote this amazing story, for example, called Pigeons from Hell. He wrote a lot of other horror stories. There's a complete horror stories of Robert E. Howard that's been published. So these guys were regularly writing in horror, and it's no small wonder that a lot of that made its way into these stories. Even C.L. Moore, I mentioned her as a contemporary of Howard. She wrote her character, Jarell of Joiry, who was sort of a heroine in a fantastic contemporary, a fantastic equivalent of France, medieval France, wrote a story called Hellsguard, which is basically, even though it has, the heroine is Jarell, it's basically a horror story, with some a little bit of swordplay tacked onto the top. It's a lot of the stuff is from that. It's from that heritage. There's a lot of horrific stuff in these stories, which, if you like that stuff, which I do, I think gives sword and sorcery some appeal. And I've always thought it should appeal more to horror readers. I'm a fan of Lovecraft, obviously, but also Stephen King, Um, Joe Lansdale, who's written some horror. Carl Edward Wagner, another guy who crossed over quite a bit from horror into sword and sorcery. Carl Edward Wagner wrote a wonderful hero, which unfortunately is hard to get in print unless you want to get it on Kindle. Kane, Kane,
Yeah, 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 yeah.
who was a great sword and sorcery hero. But Carl Edward Wagner did more work in horror, and his stuff is really horror based. He would dump werewolves and vampires and stuff in a lot of his Kane stories. So yeah, that's a big part of what the subgenre is all about. And it's not like a hard and fast rule. Talked about Clark Ashton Smith and a lot of his heroes meeting a bad end, and it's you will see this in sword and sorcery. But I guess even the ones that do, they're typically fighting back.
Yeah.
You know, they're not allowing um, their circumstances to dictate, and they're not just cowering or giving up. You know, they're always pressing on. And I think that was that was a you know something Howard believed in. I mean, as you think about it, he ultimately opted to end his own life. Although,
Yeah.
you know, I'm not going to speculate on the reasons, and it's all unique to the individual. Some people, for example, would say, well, he chose his own way out. You know, that was the way he chose to end his own life, and he was still taking action. You know, I don't want to speculate too much there, but
Yeah, yeah.
Howard
It's
believed Howard believed that we should be, you know, that's why he was a big fan of, again, of the physical sports and boxing and football. You know, that we can exert ourselves physically on the world, and that we're not helpless in the face of our circumstances. Yeah, they started corresponding. Um, oh gosh, when was it? I think it was 1932. I'm not as up on some of the scholarship of dates
yeah.
as some are, but it was right around there, 32, 33. And you know, that started a correspondence that went all the way right up to the end of Howard's life when he took his own life in 1936. And I can't recommend enough. These were collected in a 2-volume series by Hippocampus Press, um, A Means to Freedom. Um, but you know, it started out very. Howard was very deferential. Lovecraft was a much more established author at the time, um, and Howard wrote to him about one of his stories called "Rats in the Walls," and very complimentary. But he had a little bit of a critique about one of the quotes that Lovecraft put in. He pointed something out that was a slightly ahistorical, and Lovecraft wrote him back, was super impressed that this dude, you know, was that a interested in the material, and b that much of a scholar, and that set off a lengthy correspondence. I mean, this it's like hundreds of pages in these printed books, and they talked about everything. Um, you know, the origin of man as a species, and the nature of history, and whether we were on an upward ascent or a downward ascent. And they, you know, as these letters progressed, they would clash on issues. You know, one of the big ones was, and this is really how Howard formulated his central thesis of the Conan stories, was this clash of civilization and barbarism. You know, Howard kind of had a dark view of, and it wasn't all dark. It was sort of a cyclical view of how humanity progressed. You know, like we start out as this rough species. We progress to this barbaric stage where we're vital, and then we carve out an empire for ourselves, and we have this, you know, martial success on the battlefield, and we've established the cities. But then what happens is, you know, decay sets in. We start getting complacent with where we are. And he was, you know, drawing up a lot upon some of the history and the historical work being done, but also, you know, looking back at the Roman Empire, for example. I mean, it's it's what happened. They conquered most of the known world at one point. They lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years. That empire stood until it ultimately fell from, not from without, but from within. It weakened within until the barbarians overran it. And he sort of saw this as a problem endemic to civilized societies, and he was drawing upon his own experiences too of what was going on around him. He saw what was happening in his own hometown with this oil town, and he critiqued capitalism, that people were just chasing money and they were literally pumping oil out of the ground, and they were moving on to the next town and leaving that one barren, and that was the result of corporate greed. He had a lot of critiques, and him and Lovecraft did not see eye to eye on a lot of these issues, and a lot of those issues, those two of the Lovecraft and Howard talked about, are still very much relevant today. At the time, this was the 30s, and it was in the wake of World War I, and we know just what an absolute disaster that was. It was because war had become industrialized. We had perfected the Maxim machine gun, and we had perfected mustard gas, and we had perfected artillery shelling, but we hadn't come up with any sort of tactics. Military, we were still using all outdated military tactics, and of course the most outdated piece of software out there is still a human body. That hadn't changed. And the results were a disaster. You had just soldiers massacred on the field. This was not the heroic man-to-man type battles that Howard wrote about. This was, basically industrial slaughterhouses. They would just, it was just soldiers getting fed in the machine guns, and he was naturally repulsed by this. And you're right, like Lovecraft pushed back, and he thought that this was, that we were on this ascent towards something better. He had his own skepticism about other things, but in terms of technology freeing up our time, being in general for the good, Lovecraft was on that side of things, and Howard was not. Lovecraft had that cosmic pessimism, right? That was his big thing, that the universe is huge and vast and utterly uncaring, and that there are forces at work that have no interest in people other than they're just maybe a bug in their path. These elder gods that will one day arise from their slumber and essentially annihilate the earth as we know it. If unless the earth itself just goes cold and dead or burns out from the sun. But that's how things are going to end. It was very pessimistic. It was actually, it was groundbreaking for his time. No one was writing science fiction like this. No one had that particular perspective. That's why he's been so oft copied and still widely read today. This cosmic pessimism. But Howard shared a little bit of that. But again, as we said, his heroes would fight back against it. And Conan would kill slime monster coming out of the well, dog. This grotesque ancient beast that we see in the Slithering Shadow, for example, and in a Lovecraft story that would have turned out very differently.
Oh yeah,
driven insane or killed.
Oh god, it's just absolutely those two guys. Fascinating stuff.
And I think that was a wonderful relationship that spurred the development of sword and sorcery. Like, I don't know if Howard would have written, he would have infused this much into his stories. I think Lovecraft made him think more rigorously about where he was coming from and where he was in the world, and those bled into his stories. I think it was a wonderful relationship in letters, and I'm so grateful that we have these letters preserved, and you can go out and buy them pretty cheaply from hippocampus Press.
you use this word, which I'll admit I've ripped off and I've stolen hundreds of times by now. Re-enchantment.
Oh yeah.
And did you come up with that, by the way? I don't want to.
No, I did not come up with that word.
Okay.
It was I forget where I first encountered it. It wasn't in the original usage, but it was a German writer named Max Weber who was writing in um, sort of the when was he writing? Was it early 20th century? It might have even been late 19th century. And it was post Nietzsche, and it was God is dead. What do we have left in the world? And basically, we have lost that medieval mindset where we think there is a purpose to the world. Um, we're the dawn of the modern age, and the Edwardian age is gone. And he had an essay called "Science as a Vocation," and he talked about his specific quote. I just was calling this up as you mentioned, so I couldn't write. Well, the fate of our times is characterized by rationalization and intellectualization, and above all by the disenchantment of the world. Precisely the ultimate and most sublime values have retreated from public life, either into the transcendental realm of mystic life or into the brotherliness of direct, personal human relations. And he felt that loss, and he felt a need to re-enchant the world. And I think that's where fantasy fiction comes back in. It allows us to look at the world, which can seem like it's completely devoid of magic and stripped of magic, and science has an answer to everything, which it doesn't. Science has an answer to the way the world works from a physical way. Doesn't answer the questions about why we're here, what it means to be human, what purpose do we have in our lives. Science can't answer any of those questions, and anyone who tells you they can, I think, is misguided and maybe dangerous. I think we see this in Howard's works. He was trying in his own way, even though they're savage and they're bloody and they're there's a lot of combat and death, that he's actually bringing back the sort of the notion that we do have we can take action. We have a purpose. We can carve out our own fate. There was a famous essay called Conan the Existentialist, written a long time ago, well before I ever began Flaming Crimson, and was one of the inspirations for my work, about how Conan famously was, there wasn't a all-seeing benevolent being guiding his actions, but he was given strength and the sword arm at birth, and to do with it as he will. And what he did with that was he carved out an amazing life for himself, and he rose from barbarian to thief to mercenary to pirate, eventually to king of Aquilonia. And to me, that's pretty. That kind of restores a little bit of humanity to this era that's been so stripped of humanity, and is just so technologically dominated. And something I love about the genre too, that you can find in Howard. If you're people, I think maybe because of the movie, which I love, Conan the Barbarian.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's because of the commercialization and the action figures, and that they think it's just a dumb barbarian, walking around breaking things. But there's a lot more in Howard than some of his critics are willing to admit, or they haven't read him.